I would just like you to be engaged, pay attention to our next presenter, who came here all the way from the far eastern reaches of Canada, just to be with us, yes. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Max Keenlyside.
Well, thanks very much, Bill. Before I get started with the seminar, I just do want to take a chance to thank Bill for being basically the patron saint of patience while he has been at the helm of the technological side of the festival. So yeah, how about another round of applause? And now, secondly, I want to thank you for choosing to be here at the early bird set, and not only choosing an early set, but choosing this one, because I know there are always so many great options, and that's my great dilemma at these festivals, not only as a performer, but we get to be audience members, and choosing between which venue that's going on at the same time can be a bit of a difficult thing, and some sacrifices have to be made, so thank you for being here, and I hope you're going to enjoy the presentation. So today I wanted to talk about two Scott Joplin mysteries, things that I've mulled on for a number of years. I've had a love affair with Scott Joplin's music since I was a young kid. I first heard The Entertainer when I was about 9 years old, and that piece, long story short, is what inspired me to learn to play the piano and even get into music in the first place. And I quickly absorbed the entire catalog of Joplin rags, and I have to say that absorption mostly came from online, from Bill Edwards' website. But anyway, I remember learning about the piece, The Silver Swan, and I'll get to the title of The Silver Swan later, but I first learned about it from his site, and it always stuck with me that it was an unusual Joplin composition, and so I want to talk about that afterwards. But first, I'm going to be talking about another piece from Scott Joplin from a couple years earlier called Scott Joplin's New Rag. So before we start talking about that, I just want to set the stage a little bit about Scott Joplin's life in 1912. So this is our first mystery, Scott Joplin's New Rag, and let's take a look at what was going on with Scott Joplin around the time that this was published. There we have the first cover of Scott Joplin's New Rag, published by Joseph W. Stern. In summer of 1907, Scott Joplin at first moved to New York. He came from St. Louis after a profitable time there working with his publisher. And interviews from the time tell that the move to find backers for his opera, which he had been composing, Treemonisha, the move was probably partially inspired by the hope to secure funding for this production. He continued his business with John Stark. They had not yet developed any kind of rift, but he also did kind of size out his options. Around this time, you start to see him publishing with a few other publishers and not maintaining any kind of exclusivity with John Stark. Joseph Stern, the fellow who published this, was the longest lasting of these new relationships that Scott Joplin formed. He published 4 pieces of Scott Joplin's, starting with Gladiolus Rag, which is right from when he moved in 1907. Personally, my favorite Scott Joplin rag. I think it's the best thing he ever wrote. And then he followed that very quickly in the same year with Searchlight Rag, and then after that with Stop Time Rag, and then finally with Scott Joplin's New Rag. With the other publisher, Joseph Daly, who is not in New York. Unusually, he published Roseleaf Rag. There's only speculation you can make at that point as to why Joplin published a single piece with an out-of-town publisher who he never had any other association with. And then most importantly, after Scott Joplin left St. Louis and went to New York, he established a relationship with the Seminary Music Company, which has a whole complex interweb of associations that even includes Irving Berlin. Seminary published a whole bunch of Joplin pieces that are some of his most iconic, including School of Ragtime, which was the instructional pamphlet that Joplin wrote to teach aspiring pianists what ragtime was all about and how to play it. They also published Sugarcane, Pineapple Rag, Wall Street, Solace. The first 3 of those alone were in 1908, a single year. So an incredibly prolific and incredibly inspired time for Joplin. In 1909, he did Wall Street, Solace, Pleasant Moments, Country Club, Paragon, and Euphonic Sounds. So it really only went up from there. It just seems that as soon as Joplin moved to New York must have been rather good to him. By 1910, Scott Joplin had completed his work on the opera Treemonisha. And he was on the hunt for a publisher, someone to take on the costs of engraving and publishing and distributing this piece. After a year of searching, he settled, very much so settled, on taking on the entire enterprise himself, which even for a person of relative means in that era would still be a rather Herculean feat based on the size of the score of Scott Joplin's opera. This would have been astronomically expensive for Joplin. The engraving is a huge job that costs quite a bit, and even the engraving costs of a 2-page pop song would still outstrip the budgets of almost any aspiring musician of the era. It's also interesting to note that the engraving of the Treemonisha score from 1911 is almost identical in style to that of the Seminary Music Publishing Company that Scott Joplin had been publishing with so extensively. Now, many of the publications that Joplin issued with Seminary in this era were artistic successes. They developed the ideas that he'd introduced in his St. Louis years, and he was really obviously exploring new directions in ragtime, new things that could be done with the genre. He was always trying to evolve and expand it. Joplin, even though he had his distinct personal style, never stayed static. Now, despite this amount of work and all this success, Joplin was actually described by friends as being rather depressed and morose. This account comes from William Sullivan, who was a white Canadian who was taking piano lessons from Joplin, I believe it was around 1910 to 1912. And he provided this, what sounds like a fairly consistent report of what Joplin's persona was like. This past year, I was thrilled to get to hear Dr. Berlin speaking at length about the various historical accounts of Scott Joplin's personality as described by those people who were around him. And this description is fully in fitting with that, a serious man who almost had a sad air about him. Apparently, the student said that Joplin was depressed over money, health, and the difficulties that he was facing in getting Treemonisha staged. Now, what is mysterious about Scott Joplin's New Rag? All these publications, it's not a one-off from Joseph Stern. He published a few other pieces. New Rag appeared around the time of May of 1912. So this is when the Treemonisha struggles are already underway, and Joplin was probably rather distracted and also rather financially strained. This past summer, or actually at the time of writing, it would have been the summer before, I saw a copy of Scott Joplin's New Rag, and I noticed that some of the notes were a little bit different from the versions that I'd seen before. I think I was looking online at a copy on the Library of Congress website, and I'd known Scott Joplin Rag from that Dover publication that most of the pianists around here know. And I thought, why are some notes different? But it's still obviously an old engraved copy. A quick glance comparing the two scores corroborated that there are actually two musically distinct versions of Scott Joplin's New Rag, with significant differences in the music. And now that I've thought about it, I've heard some of my colleagues play version 1, and some of them play version 2, just from whichever different source they had actually learned the piece from. Now, I'm going to go through the entire score of the piece, and with your kind permission, I'd like to show you some of the differences at the piano. And I'll warn you that there are some things that are very subtle, and I will do my best to take the most technical of the things and make them explainable for folks who don't have musical inclination. So, I'm just going to move through my slides now while I'm at the piano here, and I'll demonstrate the music for you. Get the microphone set up. Yes, so can you hear me okay? Great. This is a page of the first edition of Scott Joplin's New Rag, and it contains what I believe to be some rather egregious musical errors. Now, I'm going to go back and forth between these two slides. I want you to look very, very carefully at the page and see if you happen to notice any very slight and subtle differences in the engraving. With these images, I tried to crop them so that the music lines up pretty much exactly as it was on the plates. See? I'll go back and forth a little bit. Can you see over the piano lid, or would you like me to lower it? Perfect. See, there are some notes taken in, some notes changed. Now, I'm going to exhaustively go through them, so buckle up. So there's the first page, and here's a comparison of the second page. You can see you can see that the changes continue through the rest of the piece in almost as much density. And then the next page. Look at that, there's a whole extra bar put in this piece. Isn't that incredible? A whole extra missing bar. And then the last page. I think this is fascinating to see that there are two musically distinct versions. Now, if we look here, you'll see that there is a notice of the latest instrumental and vocal successes. And using the copyright dates of these tunes is how we can date the two different versions of this piece. You can see there are indications for various other things that were issued at the time. And if you notice there, the copyright dates on those, this is the second version of the piece. Now, the second version of the piece features these copyright dates, which place that version at around 1914, which is exactly 2 years after the initial issue of this piece. Now, I want to explain why the mistakes that are in the original version seem puzzling coming from Scott Joplin. I'm going to play each one of these examples for you a couple times, doing both the incorrect version and the corrected version for your clarification. So, in this instance, Scott Joplin has started with a classical approach, something that he would have learned during his very early training, and we know that he would have learned this during his early training because his use of what is called contrary motion on the piano is evidenced in his earlier compositions. And so the example from the bottom, this comes from the introduction of the piece, right after he's done. The earlier version sounds like this, and I'll play it very slowly. And then the corrected version, you'll notice the upper one with the red notes are the ones that were changed in the later version. And you'll notice that he has omitted some of the notes in that, and it creates a greater, what composers would call an economy of voices, which means that it is more carefully constructed and that there are no superfluous notes. So just to play that first example for you again. And what Scott Joplin came up with sometime over those next 2 years was, which dovetails nicely into the next chord, because he goes, which works better than, it has a bit of a more disjointed feel. Now, Joplin also did some editing to omit what are called parallel octaves, but he also made some changes to slight things that don't make much of a difference. See the first two red notes in the upper slide there. On the lower example, he has a quarter note, which means that you hold that inner voice, basically meaning that this note is sustained below the melody. As to why Scott Joplin wanted that changed to a less complicated version, I really could not tell you. What's even more notable, though, is the second half of the second measure you see in this example. You'll notice that it is basically different music, save for the melody. And the voice writing there is what would be known to be inconsistent with Scott Joplin's writing, because I'm going to play the lower example for you, again, the earlier version, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions there. But that voice there, if you listen to this note, it doesn't go anywhere. Now, this brings me to another point I wanted to make, which was that Scott Joplin was a trained vocal singer. He ran a vocal group in his early days, and he was always known to have been a talented singer. To write voice parts in his piano writing that hang and go nowhere is very inconsistent of what we know he could do as a musician. And what he did in the later version is a better reflection of his abilities. And so it still leaves us with this question: why did he write it that way in the first place when he thoroughly knew better? This here is another great example of how he knew better. The bottom example, the earlier version, is rather unsophisticated. He has no sustained voices. There's no attention paid to the distribution of the notes. I remember that I told you that I wanted to avoid making this too technical, and I apologize because there are some of these differences that are simply too technical to remove the technicality from them. Now, this one, the earlier version, sounds like this. Whereas the revised version sounds very similar, but it has very subtle differences that make it a more musically sophisticated iteration. So you notice that it has a moving voice in the left hand which responds to the melody motion. So, which is a very sophisticated way of voicing that particular melody. Now, there are some other ones that made the melody a bit more singable. On the bottom, you'll notice that there is a rhythmic difference. The notes appear at different horizontal placements. This earlier version, it has a bit of an edge to it. It feels like there's a hiccup. And from the version that you've heard other people play, it'll come across a little bit awkward. So I'm going to play the measure before this just to give you a bit of lead-in. So you notice he delays that note from the version that you know, because I'm assuming that most of you who are familiar with this piece will have heard that measure sound like the later version, which is. I'll play them again for you right after each other so you can hear the difference. Isn't the second one better? What do you think? Yeah, it really flows, doesn't it? And by the way, the second Joplin mystery is not technical. It is a more circumstantial one. So for those who are feeling a little exasperated by the technicality of it, have no fear. Now, the third strain of Scott Joplin's New Rag is the one that really puzzles me because it has some of the biggest errors and mistakes that Joplin surely would have known. If any of the previous errors were ones that seemed egregious, this one goes beyond egregious into downright puzzling, because these are things that it's just baffling. This comes down to the construction of Joplin's chords. The bottom one, for lack of a better way of putting it, when you have a chord constructed, there are going to be 3 or 4 tones in the chord. The first chord of this theme is a G7 chord, which has the notes G, B, D, and F. The way Joplin has used the notes of that chord in this measure are unusual, in that his bass line takes the B, and his thumb takes the G, and his ring finger takes the F, and instead of making use of that 4th chord tone, the D, he just doubles the same one that he has in the bass, which is in musical part writing, the kind that Joplin was an absolute expert in. He ignores those rules to no particular gain. And so the chord that should sound like in the revised version sounds like, which is a bit of a thinner sound, isn't it? It doesn't have the same kind of fullness. So it's a very subtle difference. The earlier version, the later one, you could blink and miss this stuff. So, now's the one that we cannot blink and could not possibly miss, because Scott Joplin added, as you can see in the note, I've created this score that has the 2 versions side by side. There is a measure that does not exist in the older version. It seems that Joplin wanted to add it in for dramatic effect, and I want to take this time to note that Joplin, at this point, would have been an enormous headache to the engravers of Joseph Stern, because the way that these pieces were printed was through plate engraving, and so they would have hired a skilled New York engraver to engrave the piece on a plate. I think they used tin plates, and they had stamps that they stamped them in. And when you made mistakes, you had to take a hammer and very carefully pound out the tin plate, recut the grooves for the staff lines, and re-put in all of the symbols. Now, in the modern age with computers, if you had to add a new measure into a piece that was already published, you'd fire up your computer, and you would put it in, and the software would nicely space out the score and adjust everything for you. In 1912, not so much. In 1912, what the plate engraver would have had to have done in this instance is pound out an entire end of the stave of that sheet music, completely redo it, and somehow figure out some way to squeeze all of that music into a very, very small space. And to show you that, I'm going to go back to the earlier image of the comparison. Now, see in that if you go down to the fourth system, notice that the rest of the music on the page in the spacing does not change, but that poor engraver, look at that magical feat they pulled off in that fourth stave. Somehow squeezing all of that music into that little area. And so that gives you a bit of insight into what these changes would have entailed for the actual publication. Now, here we go. So now I'll play you this example here, even though I haven't practiced my scales lately, it might be a little bit. So here is the original earlier version without that measure. So he doesn't waste any time. He gets right into that measure. I'll play it again. The second version not only corrects some problems with the chords, but it also introduces that extra measure with a fun little melody that makes it even more dramatic. So you hear it's a whole other. It completely changes the context of that theme. Instead of a sudden interruption into something that builds up into a dramatic interlude. And now I present to you the most subtle and probably the most pointless of the changes. I think it actually gives it that Joplin character. The earlier example does not have that sort of Joplin uniqueness, that sort of weird and intoxicating effect. It's so simple as after the interlude, he comes in with a chromatic scale, and then this line here, which brings us back into the final strain of the piece. So the earlier version would happen like this. So, whereas the later version changes a single note in each hand, going up instead. And doesn't that have that kind of Joplin jauntiness? Earlier it sounds like a march if you're just going. But instead Joplin has that little, he places an idea, and then instead of repeating it like so many composers would, he offers a counter idea. And so it gives you this lovely little humorous tinge. It has that quintessential Joplin feel. I hope you agree. Now, I'll return to the podium here. No, actually, it's funny. I'd given this presentation in an altered version before, and I'd included the notes, and I actually must have done by memory a large section of what I had written in my notes. So, now, this does leave us with more questions than answers. There are a number of fronts to this. It makes you wonder if perhaps when Scott Joplin submitted his manuscript to Joseph W. Stern, if they screwed up and misread Scott Joplin's manuscript, and Joplin, after the fact, maybe panicked and thought, oh, goodness, I can't have this out in the world, and so maybe he took on the cost himself. We can only speculate about this. It would stand to reason that someone like Scott Joplin, whose reputation and ability to churn out sophisticated music that was of a higher class, that it would be important to him that this earlier version with what seemed to be mistakes be rectified. The other alternative, we have to play devil's advocate as researchers, is that there's the possibility that the lapses are actually Joplin's intent and it was just part of his creative process. It could have been Joplin's original. It may have been corrected either after his own second thoughts, or maybe someone at the publishing house at Stern caught these problems and made the change after the fact. Or, if we really want to go on a limb, It may have been after showing the score to Bruto Giannini, who was a fellow who Scott Joplin was studying with in New York. A already adult Joplin was so committed to improving his technical abilities that he continued to study late in life. It still does not parse for me, though, that Joplin, who is a very skilled and subtle composer, the best way I can articulate it is that the kind of mistakes that you see in Scott Joplin's music in the earlier version of this piece are things that you see in his very first publications, the ones that he issued in the mid-1890s. They already exhibit a knowledge of these kind of practices that just betrays everything that happens in this particular score. It also is interesting to me that I'm curious about why he could turn out such a naively flawed score and have them publish it. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my next Scott Joplin mystery. Now, how many of you, Silver Swan, your favorite Joplin rag? Any of you? Well, I won't lie, it's not mine either, but it is in the very high list. I think it is a beautiful, slightly flawed, but timeless piece of Joplin's that shows what he could do, even if it does not rank in his most memorable. Now, this piece is completely and utterly unique in Scott Joplin's catalog. I also want to note that since I made this presentation, I've actually created an improved cover. And this is one that must be viewed as an alternate and specific to the version that I created, because there is another beautiful cover also created by our own Bill Edwards. Really? Oh, I thought you made that beautiful blue one. Oh, okay. I stand corrected then. Modern scholarship is ever changing. Now, the facts that we actually do have about the Silver Swan are very scarce. There is very little we can point to about this piece and say that is definitively the case about this piece. For example, a Californian piano roll was the source of this piece. That's the one thing we can say for sure about its origin, is that a fellow over in California, I apologize because I do not recall his name at the moment, but he discovered this roll in his garage, and there's a good story to go with that. Now, this here that you see is the QRS roll, which was the first discovered copy. Unfortunately, I could not procure a photograph or scan of the roll label, but the information is preserved, and so I've reconstructed it there to show it as it would have appeared on the label. And I think the fellow's name was Al, who discovered it. And in the moment, he didn't even know what the piece was. He had a friend over. I think it may have been Smiley Wallace. And he heard the piece, and it very quickly gained traction within the ragtime world. Now, there was another roll issued of the same piece, exact same time. Master record. Some people doubted that the piece was actually Scott Joplin's. Some people thought maybe this is a hoax. But all the skepticism went completely and utterly out of the window when the national edition was discovered, because on the label, as you see, it credits Scott Joplin. The rolls were issued in 1914, and they were listed in their respective catalogs at that time, and they are the only historical appearances of the Silver Swan. The rolls and the mentioning of the roll in the catalog. That is the only artifact, the only mention. There's no mention in any listings, newspaper ads, nothing. Scott Joplin just appears out of nowhere and disappears just as quickly as it appeared. Now, as I said before, this piece, there's no part of this, aside from what I have told you up to this point, that cannot be considered to be speculation. It is educated guesses based on my knowledge of Scott Joplin, on the collective knowledge of tireless decades of research from some celebrated ragtime historians, and sort of finding ways of assimilating this knowledge and creating educated guesses. The music itself does allow us to infer some of the possible history of this piece. There is evidence in the way that Scott Joplin wrote the music itself that can allow us to create these speculations. For instance, from the outset, the music is similar to the final Scott Joplin rag, the piece that was published after his death posthumously by Stark, Reflection Rag. It has a similar character, it's in the same key, there are a number of structural similarities. Now, I believe that the Silver Swan dates from somewhere between 1907 and 1914. And when I say it originates from then, that does not refer to the roll date. That refers to the date when he would have composed it. And that is, I guess, based on the style of his other pieces and where it would seem that this kind of music fits into Scott Joplin's output. This piece came out during Joplin's masterful late phase, when, for instance, all the corrections he put into Scott Joplin's new rag, he would have been churning out music of a new level of sophistication. Because you have to understand that Scott Joplin's music was sophisticated from the beginning. Even when he was writing unsophisticated music, like his early waltzes, it had an extraordinarily unusual degree of technical polish. This is a trained musician with a good knowledge of classical music and the sophisticated ways in which it could be constructed. Now, it's also worth noting that when Scott Joplin likely wrote this piece, he was busy at work on his opera Treemonisha. And there may have been certain cross-influences in terms of the direction he was trying to head artistically. Now, let's dig into what is mysterious, and I promise you it's not nearly as technical as Scott Joplin's new rag. Well, for starters, we're going to look at what happened after the roll was discovered, with the 1971 publication of a transcription of the piece. Now, this version, the man to whom all ragtimers owe an enormous debt of gratitude would be Richard Zimmerman, Dick to many of us, who has long been a key figure in the ragtime world. Now, he established the precedent for everything that I have done with this presentation and in my own transcription of the piece. He created his own transcription from the piano roll in collaboration with several other folks. And now he faced some challenges when he created his transcription. For one thing, he had to reduce the heavily orchestrated roll. Now, how many of you are familiar with the arranging practices or what piano rolls sound like as compared to a live human performance? Well, basically in piano rolls, that they had the opportunity to put extra notes into the roll that a normal human being with 10 fingers, unlike Frederick Hodges, could play. And so they took advantage of that. The impetus seems to have been that a person would get more bang for their buck if they had a piano roll that had extra notes. So with the piano roll that you didn't get to hear, the melody, I can't do it all hands at the same time, but the phrase that would have sounded like wound up sounding, the right hand part alone wound up sounding like that sort of dense, and then the left hand like this big, big, big sound. So that was just the first challenge he faced. The other obstacle was to decide what of the extra notes that seemed to be extra were Joplin's original manuscript, and which ones were decisions by the roll arranger who took Scott Joplin's manuscript and turned it into an arranged piano roll. Now, outside of that, he also had to decide what things to add in that weren't included in the roll, what kind of editorial decisions to make, such as tempo indicators, phrasing, dynamics, the volume at which you were to play the piece, things like that. He had to make his own decisions about how to write those in the score. Now, the edition was published in 1971 with a copyright assigned to the Lottie Joplin Trust, Lottie, of course, being Scott Joplin's widow. And I think that the work that Mr. Zimmerman did was pioneering, and I'm extremely grateful to him for setting that precedent. And I want to preface that the work that I've done in retranscribing the roll is not in any way intended as a slight or to devalue the work that was done before about this piece. Now, I think that his transcription, it was pioneering and it was largely successful. It gave us a clean score that let you know how the piece sounded, and it made the work accessible to pianists worldwide, which we can all be thankful for. And I want to explain what is different in my transcription from both the piano roll and from Zimmerman's transcription. Now, if I can get my pages sorted here. Okay. It is notable that starting with the 1971 publication, from the transcription, the piece is always written as Silver Swan Rag, as the same title format as, say, the Maple Leaf Rag. Silver Swan Rag. It rolls off the tongue. However, that seems to be an error based both on the roll labels and the catalog listing for the piece. It may seem like semantics, but Joplin was using very artful titles late in life, and the wording is actually the Silver Swan. Now, oh yes, there's some musical examples I'll get to in a moment. In this edition, what I did was I started from scratch. I tried to remain objective by not consulting Zimmerman's transcription while creating my own. And I tried to ensure an accurate transcription by contacting a friend of mine from New Zealand who has an original copy of the piano roll and working from a source copy of the original roll. And that was in an effort to attain the greatest accuracy possible. I've also included what are dynamic markings in this piece. And one thing that I was puzzled by as I created my transcription of the score was that the dynamic markings, which are things like the expression indicators, indicating whether to play a passage forte or a piano, very loud or soft, or things like crescendos and diminuendos, hairpin lines that indicate you're supposed to get louder or quieter. There are a number of them in the Zimmerman transcription. On the original piano roll, the one that was issued by both QRS and National, they had a feature on the piano roll, which is as the roll scrolled along and the music played, there was a line printed on the roll. And the line goes up or down sideways on the page, and that indicates how loud that passage is supposed to be played. There's a little lever you can use on player pianos that controls the dynamics of the music. And it wasn't. No. It was a standard 88 note. Yeah, but this line there indicated the dynamic level, and the dynamics that are included in the earlier 1971 transcription do not reflect the dynamics that appear on the roll. So they are slightly different, and that is something that I've incorporated. When I transcribed the roll, I tried to make the dynamics and the expression indicators reflect both the line on the roll and also other precedents set by other Scott Joplin publications from the time. Back to musical examples. Now, it's also important for me to say with this particular piece, even though I've done everything I can to make an accurate transcription, it is not what classical musicians would call urtext, or I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but that is a score, that is a publication that uses exclusively the original source and is the closest thing the world can get to an accurate representation of what the composer intended. In this case, we can't know that. There's just no way. I cannot even dream of presenting this as that. Now, I'm going to go through a couple little examples of differences from the piano roll. First off, this is an orchestration, so I'm going to switch over to the piano. So this particular example comes at the end of the very beginning of the piece. I'm sure some of you might be wondering which Joplin rag this is. It's the one that starts like... What you see on the left there is a literal representation of what was on the piano roll. And you can see that is a Frederick Hodgian version of the piece. With all this stuff going on, the right hand at once. It's a very dramatic effect. All that at once. In the transcription, in order to remain objective, I just removed the top notes and didn't change anything that happened in the middle. So that phrase, just very playable. Now, one thing that I have observed about the roll that has started some arguments among my friends is a particular phrase that happens in the lovely B strain of this piece, where there is a little sort of a toodle-oodle that happens in the middle of the theme. And I think it was actually the addition of an editor, the roll editor. And it would be bordering on too technical to get into why this is the case. But the long and the short of it is that when the roll editor arranged the piano roll, he would have taken what was on Scott Joplin's manuscript and faithfully punched that into the roll, and then added in these kind of additions on top by doubling the octaves. So in this case, we have a phrase that I speculate the original manuscript, I'll play the bar before, would have sounded like this. The piano roll, when they arranged it, it had that as the chord. These notes are exactly what appears, but when they added the extra notes up top, you see there are some fun little filigrees. That was because those notes played like this. In addition, on top of what I just played, it would be... So it has a little bit of an extra filigree. To give you an example of how that sounds put together, that particular bar would have sounded like... So it's kind of an interesting little filigree. The second being this lovely, dainty trio, which is a beautiful melody. I think it's one of the nicest ones Scott Joplin ever wrote. The piano roll, in order to give people that bang for their buck, beefed it up. And so, at risk of being sloppy with a big score here, this is what the piano roll kind of sounded like. This is a direct transcription of the roll. You get the idea. It has all this, a kind of style normally reserved for very loud and brash and dramatic passages. The melody in and of itself seems like more of one of Joplin's voice-like melodies. You had a very lovely gift for writing very delicate-sounding, very thinly scored melodies. Look at, say, the B strain of Elite Syncopations, where he has a simple line. Or say the contemporary to this piece, or roughly contemporary, Country Club, the trio. This melody, I believe, falls in character with those particular Joplin pieces. And so if you reduce it to what I speculate it would be, it would sound something like this. A more elegant solution. It just begs to be sung by a trained soprano, which I promise you I'm not. It's a very beautiful melody. Now, at risk of going into more technicality, I would rather play the piece for you briefly and then take some time to field any questions, if there are any, and beyond questions, perhaps a discussion, because this is a kind of subject that merits a back and forth. So, with your permission, I'll play you the piece now, and then we can dig into it. So think of your questions. And also, before I get into that, thank you for being here again, and I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you have been stimulated by some of this. How are we doing for time? Do we have time for a couple questions, or? Perfect. I'll go from order of closest to me.
Not a question, but a comment. I was first introduced to Silver Swan on an LP I had, probably produced in the 70s, but I got it in the 80s. Cameron Dulcimer Quartet called Trapezoid.
Wow.
Oh my God, it is hauntingly beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
That was my first exposure to it. And in the liner notes, it said that it was attributed to Joplin. Because back then they weren't sure yet.
Okay,
And
okay.
I made a cassette of it and sent it to David Ruff, and he'd like to play it on his radio show. I don't know if he ever got it or not, but
But
just,
for those who couldn't hear, we just heard about an enchanting early recording on LP of this piece on a hammered dulcimer, 4 hammered dulcimer ensemble. That would sound quite lovely, I have to imagine. Very unique experience. Oh, thank you for that. And I see a question from this gentleman here, and then Mr. Hodges.
The Silver Swan was not considered red. Joplin was not considered it one.
I think that he did consider it a rag because there were a number of pieces that he issued in his lifetime that did not have rag in the title. And also in the subtitle, as indicated on the roll label, it does say either ragtime two-step or Silver Swan, period, rag. And so it seems that there was a distinction made there to not have it in the title, but still to have it be considered a ragtime piece. Yeah, for sure.
Scott Joplin's new rag. Do you think those were really mistakes in the first version, or he saw the first version and thought, hey, I can make this better?
I think that based on what we see in the consistency of Joplin's earlier works across different publishers, all of the sophisticated things that Scott Joplin could do appear in different cities, let alone different publishers. And so it removes any question about whether this is a matter of his own abilities and his own creative process, and turns it into something completely removed from that. Regardless of what the case is, I don't think he would have considered that first edition to be something that was polished and up to his standards of what he could do up to that time. And Mr. Hodges.
As someone who learned the Dick Zimmerman version many years ago, I was astonished and just transfixed by those beautiful cello lines that you played there. And are those in the original piano roll? Are they in your transcription? And where can I buy it?
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. I wanted to add, after I played that just by force of habit, there are some little filigrees, some maxisms found their way into that performance. So even more so than my own transcription, that performance cannot be considered Joplin urtext. I'll write them down and show you. I'll send them to you at some point. The lines that Frederick was mentioning were when I would go and play. This never appeared in a Joplin piece. That was, I apologize, that's my own interruption in the piece. Yeah. And from Mr. Dowling.
Going back to New Rag, I may have an answer for you. I say may have an answer for you to explain the problems of why the first edition is so strange with its mistakes. I've worked for the last 15 years as a sheet music editor for 3 different classical music publishers. And so I take classical music, by established composers and create new urtext performing editions of existing music. So I'm working based on old editions. When I have access to the manuscript, great. Sometimes there is no manuscript. But having spent literally thousands of hours working with the in-house engravers at those 3 different companies and different engravers on different projects, I can tell you that engravers are not the smartest people.
Be careful, you're talking to an engraver here.
You are a musician who performs. And most engravers, although of course you have to be a musician, I know you're going to make a comment.
No,
So
we have
just
to.
let me finish first. My point is that they don't tend to be performers. So since I'm making a performance edition, putting in fingerings, and I'm correcting misprints from old editions, I notate my scores really carefully, red pencil for mistakes that need to be fixed, and then explanations in blue pencil to the engraver of how I want it done. And if it's not possible to explain it in words, then I draw another stack at the bottom of the page and write it out exactly how I want it done. I would say that only 6 times out of 10 does the engraver follow my instructions.
I want to close with a quick response to what you said and a little connection that just clicked right here. I mentioned earlier that these pieces were written around the time of tree militia, and I promise, Bill, I'll keep it brief. I apologize for going over time here. Now, exactly what you were talking about, the exact kind of changes. You say circling some wrong notes, even drawing a staff on the bottom of the page and writing out the correct version of what it's supposed to be. We know for fact that Scott Joplin did just that on another piece. That piece is Tree Minutia. There exists a copy of the original score for Tree Minutia, the piano vocal, that, assuming to be the first copy coming back from the engravers, has corrections written in Scott Joplin's hand. I do not know who owns this copy at the time, but there is a copy out there with Scott Joplin corrections, and thank you for bringing that forward, because that kind of supports what came here.
I'll just get to the point, which is that one time I complained to one of these engravers. Now, granted, it was an extremely complicated piece with potential pitfalls everywhere, but there were so many mistakes in the original edition that I was determined to make it error-free. And every time I would send in, the first time I sent in my corrections, I came back and looked through it, and I thought, you only did about 2/3 of what I asked you. So, and then I sent it again with more instructions list. I got about another 20% fixed, but we're still nowhere near close. And so I finally wrote the engraver an email, and I said, not only you're not following all of my instructions, but you're also adding in new mistakes. Can you be a little less careless? And you know what he wrote back to me? He said, do you know how many mouse clicks it takes to start a new edition from scratch? And put it all into the computer, and he said, if I have a 5 to 10% error rate, consider yourself lucky. And then the clincher was, you were the editor, it's your job to catch the mistakes, and mine to fix them. So my point is, if Joplin is so busy working on Tree Minutia, there would be no time or interest, even on his part as a composer, to go and even look at the proofs of the first. He just turned it in, and if the composer's handwriting is illegible, or nearly illegible, or questionable, the engraver just slaps notes on the plate and you're done with it.
And maybe when the dust had settled from Tree Minutia by 1914, he looked at the score and thought, oh, that engraver. Well, anyway, I don't want to take too much more time from this, so I just want to say thank you again for being here. I hope you enjoyed. Have a great festival. Thank you.